So, tell you a little bit about myself. I was here as an undergraduate an awful long time ago at Gray's Nose, BNC. I was studying physics. And actually, it's quite interesting coming back here because my first year at Oxford was a kind of life crisis. I was going through asking a whole kind of questions about the meaning of life, universe, and everything, and also just thinking ahead, to my future, what was I going to do? And during that life crisis, I actually decided to switch from physics and start again reading medicine. And so, for various reasons, I wasn't able to carry on at Oxford. I ended up going down to London and training as a doctor down there. And it was the kind of contrast between the dreaming spires up here and the gritty reality of South London, practicing medicine in the grimy reality of London. But it was kind of wake up to the reality of life. So I worked for a long time as a medic, as a paediatrician, specialising in the care of newborn babies. So looking after some incredibly tiny, vulnerable little babies using very high-tech methods, and in particular also as a research scientist, I'm particularly interested in neuroscience, brain damage, and all that kind of heavy stuff. And as a result, I've been involved really with death and dying professionally, caring for dying babies and dying adults, and also philosophically, I teach medical ethics, and so that's a major area of my interest. And personally, I've been confronted with tragedy in my own life, family. So this is much more than just a kind of theoretical question. And I want to say right up, sort of trigger warning. It's perfectly possible that some of you have been had personal experience of death, or bereavement, or loss of close ones. And we're going to be talking about some heavy stuff, including suicide and death, bereavement, suffering, and so on. So if it's all too close to home, of course, I understand that. And it's a bit interesting, isn't it? Here we are, you just arrived at Oxford, many of you, your first year, this is all great new thing. And what are we going to talk about? Death. Really? Well, don't blame me, I didn't plan the programme, but that's what we're talking about. So it's interesting also that COVID, although it's now vanishing into the rearview mirror, forced a lot of people to confront the reality of death. Because most of us go through life just pretending that death doesn't exist. And yet when you get these kind of shocking images of mass graves and ITUs full of people on ventilators, and a lot of my close friends, I didn't get called back. I'd retired from by the time of the pandemic, and I think I felt that an outdated baby doctor was probably not the most valuable person in the NHS at the time. But a lot of my friends were working in places like this, and went through extraordinary experiences of people dying and having to hold up phones to speak to their loved ones because they weren't allowed to come into the hospital. And it's striking, for thousands of people in the UK and across the world, this was the last thing they saw on planet Earth. It was some anonymous professional pushing them into ITU, and they died. The mortality, particularly for old people, was huge in ITU. So one of the psychological consequences of the pandemic was how the elevated levels of what psychologists call death anxiety. And so the theory is that all of us as children come to this experience, realization that everybody dies. That's something that you actually have to discover as a child. And once you've discovered that, you then have a realization, that means my parents are going to die. Hang on a minute, that means I'm going to die. And every child sort of works that out. And then the question is, what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that knowledge? And for many people, you just pretend it doesn't exist, get on with your life. And yet when things like the pandemic happen, and people just get confronted with these images, and particularly if they then have an experience of losing loved ones and so on, there's a whole resurgence of death anxiety. So I happened to have a sneak preview. There was a big study of the UK population which has just been done. It hasn't been published yet, but it just so happened I've had a sneak preview of the results. And I can't give you all the details, but this is what they looked at the entire population. If you just look at 18 to 24-year-olds, which is most of you, how often do you think about your own death? And what is fascinating is the range. So you get some people who say, even in this age group, they think about it more than one time a week, more than once a week, through to the entire other end of the spectrum, less than once every 6 months, or 8% of people said never. So immediately you can see this huge individual difference in how people respond emotionally, psychologically, spiritually to their own death. And this was also the survey. As you think about your own death, what emotion do you have? And this is ranked in order of frequency. So sadness is absolutely very high up there. Acceptance, interestingly, is also a major emotion, people said. But fear and anxiety, very significant percentage of those. Interestingly, hope was down there. So why would you be hopeful as you think about your own death? That's something we'll come back to. So how do people cope with the reality of death? And I've been very influenced by the work of a guy called Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who was in Germany at the time of the Nazis. And he was a Jew, he was in prison, he was in Auschwitz. And he survived Auschwitz, although many of the people that went into Auschwitz died. And he, at the end of the war, when he was released from Auschwitz, he wrote a book which is still in print and still available, and which turned out to be incredibly influential. And it's called Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, the language is dated, but you know, the impact of this book made a huge impact. And he then started a whole new approach to psychotherapy. And basically, what he was arguing was that meaning, having a meaning, that's not shut. What he noticed was that the people who survived Auschwitz were the people who had some reason to live. And that a lot of people gave up any kind of sense of meaning or hope, and those were the people who died. And I happen to have a friend of mine who's a consultant psychiatrist in London, and he's cared for many asylum seekers and survivors of torture and imprisonment elsewhere in the world. And he says the people who survive torture and solitary confinement and terrible abuse in prison are those who have some reason for hope. Those who give way to despair, they either just die or they become psychotic. They lose contact with reality. And Viktor Frankl said the same thing, and for him, the thing that kept him up through was the love of his wife. He knew that his wife was also in another concentration camp. And he recounts several experiences. So it's well worth reading, I recommend it. But this is one of the things that a thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers, that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. that I grasp the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought really have to impart. The salvation of humans is through love and in love. And actually, my experiences in neonatal intensive care mirror that. The parents who were able to survive emotionally some of the most terrible experiences of watching their babies suffer and sometimes die were those who found some kind of possibility of hope, some kind of meaning in their child's illness. And so Viktor Frankl summed it up in a famous slogan. He said this: "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. And so what it tells us is that human beings need meaning in order to survive. They need meaning they need a narrative in which we can find ourselves and see a purpose for our lives, and in which we can place our experiences. And it's a fascinating thing about human beings. We are meaning-seeking creatures. It doesn't seem to be the same for many other organisms. As far as we know, many living organisms on this planet don't spend the whole of their time wondering about what the meaning of it all is. But human beings do. Human beings need a narrative. And so, and one of the sad things I have to say to you, and many of you are, at the beginning of your lives, and you're here at Oxford and looking forward to the future. The sad thing I have to tell you is at some point in your life, almost everybody here, you're going to face some catastrophic reality which comes out of the blue and hits you. Something totally unexpected and devastating and awful. And that's what happens. I have a close friend of mine here in Oxford, a doctor who I knew very well, married with children, who comes home to find his son hanging on the banisters as he walks into the house, having committed suicide, and he's dead completely. So finding a meaning, finding some kind of narrative, and yet the commonest reaction that people have to the reality of death is denial. Let's just pretend it doesn't exist. And it's pretty obvious that this is a very maladaptive way of dealing with the reality of death, of just pretending that it doesn't exist. And yet it's very common. Some people even will say it's the best way to live, just carry on as though it doesn't exist. I'm reminded of the Monty Python song famously sung at funerals and so on. Always think of the bright things of life. Just a cheery song, because death is meaningless, a sick joke. Let's just pretend it doesn't exist. So, what other possible approaches to death? Well, resignation. And this is a very ancient approach to the problem of death. In fact, arguably, if you take many of the Eastern religions, such as Buddhism and other Eastern religions, their fundamental teaching is that all suffering comes from desire, or fear, all negative emotions. And the way to cope with this is to recognize that actually there is no reality. And once you realize that, you realize that death is nothing. That's the idea, which is effectively a form of spiritual resignation. It is simply an illusion. There is no suffering. There is no pain. There is no ultimate reality behind suffering. It's an illusion. But of course, there are other forms of resignation. Resignation that can take different forms of kind of stoicism. But it's one of the very common forms. And one of the modern versions of ancient stoicism is what's called the positive death movement. So this is the idea that you have death cafes You actually talk about it. You discuss death. And the idea is death is completely natural. That's what happens. We are living organisms. We are born, we flourish, we decay, we die. It's the cycle of life. It's completely natural and normal. And the natural death movement, the positive death movement, says you just got to get with the project. That's that same kind of a modern version of resignation. And then this is one of their quotes: "For a man who has done his natural duty, death is as natural as." In other words, there's nothing to see here. It's simply the cycle of life. Another response to the reality of death is completely different, and that is control. I am not going to accept that this is out of my control. I'm going to seize it and take control. And this takes different forms. One of the most fascinating things to me is that what's happening in Silicon Valley is there are a whole number of extremely rich, almost entirely men, who've made obscene amounts of money out of tech and tech entrepreneurs. And they are terrified of death. And their response is, they've gone through the whole of their life. Whenever there's a problem, what do? You throw money at it. And so now I'm going to throw money at it, and I'm going to defeat death. And there are billions of pounds now. This is a huge new investment opportunity. People are pouring money into the biological defeat of death. We're going to find ways. In fact, Calico is set up by Alphabet. This is Google. It's related to Google, and it is entirely about tackling aging, but ultimately about the idea is to try to defeat death by tech, by understanding the biological mechanisms and then intervening in order to reverse them. And one of the most sort of tragic-comic is the idea of freezing your body in liquid nitrogen, and then in the forlorn hope that in some future, when science has advanced, you can get thawed out and reanimated. And you can either have the full version, in which case your whole body is frozen and put in, or you can have the cut-price version, believe it or not, and basically they decapitate you and you just get your head stored in liquid nitrogen in the hope that somebody who not only can re-thaw you but can attach you to another body or possibly to a kind of advanced AI system or whatever. So that's one version of control. The other version of control is assisted suicide. So this guy on the right here is called Jeff Spector, and he says he was diagnosed with a cancer of the spine, and he was told by the doctors it wasn't going to kill him, but it would, as it grew, it was going to eventually mean that he would be paralysed. He'd be in a wheelchair, and he says, absolutely no way, Jose. So he calls all his friends together, they have a celebration meal, this is it. And at the meal, he tells them, I've got a plane ticket to Dignitas the following morning in Switzerland. And he went off to Switzerland, took a lethal dose of operatives and died. And that view that the best way to control death is to have a legalized assisted dying. So the campaign called Dignity in Dying is all about control. And for many people, they say it's outrageous that I can't control my death. I can control everything else about my life, but I can't control the timing or the manner of my own death. And this is the 21st century. So of course I should have the right to control myself. So coming to the end, what about Christian thinking about death? And Christian thinking about death is actually quite interesting and quite counterintuitive. Because the first thing that Christian thinking says about death is that it's not natural. In other words, that's the complete antithesis of the natural death movement. How on earth can Christianity say that? Well, that's a big, deep question, and I haven't time to unpack it in detail, but I'm happy to do that if you want to talk about some more. Basically, what Christian thinking says is this is not the way it was meant to be. And it's interesting, because when you look at somebody, in their 90s who've had, major illnesses and so on, and the last death is occurring, then it can seem like quite a kind of a natural end to life. But when you see, as a parent, holding the dead body of your baby in your arms, there is this deep sense of outrage. This is not the way it should be. That death is wrong. It's something that is so hard to come to terms with. And the same happens with suicide, with my friends trying to get their heads around the fact that their son killed himself. So what Christianity says is death is an enemy. And interestingly, the roots of the modern medical profession, the whole healthcare professions, is actually rooted in Christianity and in the Christian monasteries. That's where it comes from. Why does it come from? Because it was Christianity that said death is an enemy, and we are going to use everything we can to try to vote in favour of life and not death. And so healthcare, the whole development of why are we fighting against that? Many times in my career, I have literally stayed up all night trying to keep one little baby alive. And it's almost like death has been coming there, and I have been using all the technology, all the resources, all my experience, everything to try and keep death away. Why? Because death is an enemy. And because we fight against death. Because it's not natural. So death is an enemy, but, and then Christian thinking gets even more bizarre, what it says is that God himself enters into the experience of suffering and death. God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth actually experienced death in his own body. He took death into his own being and destroyed it on the cross. And then he rises to life, as the way the Bible says is that he's the first fruits of the new creation. He's the first glimpse we have of what's to come, of a reality in which death is destroyed. And actually, Christian baptism is a profound symbol of all this. So I became a Christian as a young man, and I was baptized as a sign of my Christian faith. And one of the interesting things about life is you live it forwards and you understand it backwards. And now, age 70, I understand a lot more about what was going on 50 years ago. And one of the things I've learned is how profound Christian baptism is, because the whole idea in baptism, the symbolism, is that you go into the waters of death. In fact, you're joined with Christ in the waters of death. And then as you come out of the water, that is the sign of new life, of resurrection. That's what baptism is. It's being united in the death of Christ in order that we can experience the resurrection of Christ. So death is an enemy which you must fight against, but by God's hidden power, death can change into being a gateway, a severe mercy, or a door into a new life. And so this is really important when you're practicing medicine. So this interface, we fight against death because it's an enemy, and yet we've got to know the limits to know when it's time to actually take our hands away and allow death to occur, and when it changes into a kind of healing or a strange mercy. And actually, extraordinarily, dying well is an opportunity. Time and time again, I have seen how it's when people are dying that the most extraordinary things can happen. I've seen relationships being healed. I've seen people being transformed. I've seen people finding faith. I've seen extraordinary things happen when people are dying. So dying well is not just something incredibly negative and damaging. It can be something very positive. And in my own experience caring for babies who were dying, this was one baby who was dying, we were unable to keep the baby alive, but just allowing the baby to die well in the arms of the parents. We started an annual service for the parents of all the babies who died on our baby unit. And they used to come along, including the siblings, and they used to write down the cards. Every card represents a name of a baby who died. And at the end of the service, these cards were brought forward, and the parents. That service was an extraordinary experience of sadness and loss. And yet there was, strangely, a kind of hope, a positive element. And I love this quote, which says that suffering is not a question which demands an answer, it's not a problem which demands a solution, it's a mystery which demands a presence. And so, I recommend, if you want to read further, I recommend to you a really serious theological book. And it's this one, written by an Oxford Don, it's down the road. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And if you want to get a picture of a Christian thinking of life and death, I can't recommend anything better than that. I've got some very inadequate books compared to C.S. Lewis, but if you're interested, there's a book called Matters of Life and Death, which is about medical ethics. This is particularly about assisted suicide and palliative care, and this is Dying Well. And I've got some copies for sale there. I've also got a podcast and a website if you're interested and want to take it further. But I'll stop there, and if you want to ask any questions, do.